A king on trial for treason. A nation torn apart by war. Charles I, a ruler once believed to be chosen by divine right, now stood helpless as his crown slipped from his grasp. His decisions sparked a conflict that would rip the country apart and lead to a shocking end, his own execution. How did a powerful monarch end up facing the executioner's blade? What choices pushed the nation into civil war? The fate of a king and the future of England were forever changed. As we uncover the dramatic fall of Charles I. Early life. Charles was born on November 19, 1600, in Dunfermline Palace, Fife. He was the second son of King James VI of Scotland and of Denmark. At just over a month old, Charles was baptized in Edinburgh at the Chapel Royal of Holyrood Palace and given the title Duke of Albany, as was the tradition for the second son of a Scottish king. When Queen Elizabeth I of England died without an heir in 1603, Charles's father, James VI, became King of England as James I. Due to his weak health as a baby, Charles stayed in Scotland while his family moved to England. By the age of 3, Charles had gained enough strength to join his family in England. Upon arrival, he was placed in the care of Elizabeth, Lady Carey, who helped him overcome his weak ankles by making him wear special boots. Although Charles struggled with speech, eventually developing a lifelong stammer, he steadily grew stronger. In 1605, he was made Duke of York and later Knight of the Bath. Under the guidance of his tutor, Thomas Murray, Charles studied languages, classics, and religion. As Charles grew, he became skilled in horseback riding, shooting, and fencing. Though he was often overshadowed by his older brother, Henry Frederick, the Prince of Wales. Tragically, Henry died in 1612 at just 18 years old, leaving Charles as the heir to the throne. Following this, Charles inherited several titles and, in 1616, was named Prince of Wales and Earl of Chester. Despite his challenges in early life, Charles would rise to take on the responsibilities awaiting him as the future king. Heir apparent. In 1613, Charles's sister Elizabeth married Frederick V, Elector Palatine, and moved to Heidelberg. In 1617, Archduke Ferdinand of Austria, a Catholic, was elected King of Bohemia. The following year, Bohemians rebelled and chose Frederick, leader of the Protestant Union, as their king. This move against Ferdinand, who was soon elected Holy Roman Emperor, triggered the 30 Years' War, a conflict that soon spread across Europe. England, watching from the sidelines, saw it as a fight between Catholics and Protestants. In 1620, Frederick was defeated at the Battle of White Mountain, and his lands were invaded. Meanwhile, King James sought a marriage between Charles and Ferdinand's niece, Infanta Maria Anna of Spain, hoping it would bring peace. However, this plan proved unpopular in England, where Parliament was hostile to Spain and wanted a Protestant marriage for Charles. In 1621, tensions rose when Parliament hoped for war with Spain and stricter laws against Catholics. The impeachment of Lord Chancellor Francis Bacon without the king's approval set a new precedent, foreshadowing future events under Charles's reign. James, frustrated by Parliament's demands, dissolved it in early 1622. Charles and Buckingham, James's close advisor, secretly traveled to Spain in 1623 to negotiate the marriage. However, the trip was a disaster. The Spanish demanded that Charles convert to Catholicism, among other conditions that were unacceptable to Parliament. Charles returned to England without a bride, but to the public's relief. Soon after, he and Buckingham pressured James to declare war on Spain. In 1624, with James in poor health, Charles and Buckingham were already taking control of the kingdom. Parliament was summoned to approve funds for war, leading to the impeachment of the Lord Treasurer, Lionel Cranfield, who opposed the conflict due to its costs. James warned Charles about the dangers of reviving impeachment, a tool that would later be used against Charles and his allies. By the time James died in 1625, Charles and Buckingham had assumed much of the power in England. Early reign. After the failure of the Spanish marriage plan, Charles and Buckingham turned their focus to France. On May 1, 1625, Charles married 15-year-old French Princess Henrietta Maria by proxy at the doors of Notre Dame in Paris. Charles had previously seen her during a visit to Spain. They finally met in person on June 13, 1625, in Canterbury. Charles postponed the start of his first parliament until after the marriage was finalized to avoid any potential opposition. Many in Parliament were against his marriage to a Catholic, fearing it might lead to easing restrictions on Catholic recusants and threaten the Church of England. Publicly, Charles assured Parliament that he would not relax these restrictions, but secretly promised to do so in a marriage agreement with his brother-in-law, Louis XIII of France. The agreement also loaned 7 English naval ships to France, which were later used to suppress the Protestant Huguenots in La Rochelle. On February 2, 1626, Charles was crowned at Westminster Abbey, but Henrietta Maria did not attend due to her refusal to take part in a Protestant ceremony. Concerns over Charles's religious stance grew when he supported Richard Montague, a controversial anti-Calvinist cleric. Montague's writings argued against Calvinist ideas of predestination, favoring free will, which upset many Puritans. To protect Montague, Charles appointed him as a royal chaplain, raising further suspicions that he secretly supported Arminianism and, by extension, a return of Catholic influence. Parliament, wanting a more affordable approach to war, pushed for a naval attack on Spanish colonies in the Americas. However, the funds granted for this plan were insufficient for Charles's broader war aims. The Commons also restricted his right to collect customs duties, which had previously been granted to monarchs for life. Although Charles continued to collect the duties without Parliament's approval, tensions rose between the king and Parliament. A naval expedition against Spain, led by Buckingham, failed miserably, leading to calls in Parliament for his impeachment. Charles, showing support for Buckingham, appointed him as Chancellor of Cambridge University and arrested 2 members of Parliament who had spoken against the Duke. This move angered the Commons, but Charles remained loyal to Buckingham and dissolved Parliament rather than remove him from power. At the same time, Charles's relationship with Henrietta Maria worsened, with disputes over her household staff and religious practices. In August 1626, he expelled most of her French attendants. Despite earlier agreements with France, in 1627, Charles launched a military campaign to support the Huguenots at La Rochelle, led by Buckingham. The campaign ended in failure, and public resentment towards Buckingham grew. To fund the war, Charles introduced a forced loan without Parliament's consent. Those who refused to pay were imprisoned. In the 5 Knights case of November 1627, the court ruled that the king had the right to imprison people without trial. In 1628, Parliament passed the Petition of Right, demanding that Charles respect citizens' rights, including the need for parliamentary approval to levy taxes. Charles agreed to the petition but continued to collect customs duties without Parliament's authorization. On August 23, 1628, Buckingham was assassinated. Charles was devastated, grieving privately for 2 days. While the public celebrated Buckingham's death, the tensions between Charles and Parliament remained. However, Buckingham's death coincided with a positive change in Charles's relationship with Henrietta Maria. By November 1628, their earlier conflicts had ended, and their bond grew stronger. Especially when Henrietta Maria became pregnant for the first time. The couple became known for their close family life, presenting an image of virtue and formality at court. Personal rule. In January 1629, Charles I addressed the second session of the English Parliament, which had been suspended since June 1628. He spoke calmly about the issue of tonnage and poundage, a tax on goods. However, members of Parliament, angered by the case of John Rawle, who had his goods confiscated for not paying this tax, began to protest. Many believed that this tax went against the Petition of Right, which limited the king's powers. When Charles tried to suspend Parliament on March 2, members reacted by holding the Speaker, Sir John Finch, in his chair so they could voice their opposition to the king's policies, including those on religion and taxes. Charles was furious and dissolved Parliament. He also imprisoned several of its leaders, turning them into symbols of resistance and sparking widespread sympathy for their cause. With Parliament dissolved, Charles had to find ways to raise money without its help. He made peace with France and Spain, as he lacked the funds for war. The next 11 years, known as the personal rule or the 11 years tyranny, saw Charles ruling without calling Parliament, though this wasn't unprecedented. The real problem was that without Parliament, Charles couldn't legally raise taxes. Instead, he relied on his traditional rights and prerogatives to gather funds. One method was the revival of an old law, a distraint of knighthood, which required wealthy men to be knighted at the king's coronation. Those who failed to attend were fined. Another controversial tax was ship money. Traditionally, this was collected during wartime from coastal regions, but Charles extended it to the entire country during peacetime. Although the tax brought in substantial revenue, it sparked widespread opposition, with critics arguing that it was unlawful. Ship money, along with other taxes, like monopolies, became increasingly unpopular. For example, Charles granted a monopoly on soap, which people derisively called Popish soap due to its Catholic connections. Additionally, he demanded money from the Scottish nobility by reclaiming lands given to them since 1540 unless they paid annual rents. Charles's financial policies caused unrest, including riots over the sale and clearing of royal forest lands. By 1640, his government was nearly bankrupt. Desperate, Charles seized silver bullion and spices from the East India Company and the City of London, promising to return the value with interest, though this only worsened his standing among merchants and citizens. Religious conflicts. Throughout Charles's reign, the English Reformation remained a major point of political contention. Arminian theology, which emphasized clerical authority and the individual's ability to accept or reject salvation, was viewed by opponents as both heretical and a potential avenue for reintroducing Catholicism. Many Puritans considered Charles overly sympathetic to Arminianism and opposed his desire to steer the Church of England in a more traditional, sacramental direction. At the same time, his Protestant subjects, closely following the European War, grew increasingly frustrated with his diplomacy with Spain and perceived lack of effective support for the Protestant cause abroad. In 1633, Charles appointed William Laud as Archbishop of Canterbury. Together, they introduced reforms aimed at promoting religious uniformity, which included curbing nonconformist preachers, enforcing the use of the Book of Common Prayer, reorganizing church architecture to emphasize the altar's importance, and reissuing King James's Declaration of Sports, which allowed secular activities on Sundays. The dissolution of the Fefes for Impropriations, a group that purchased church positions to install Puritan ministers, further escalated tensions. Laud's enforcement of these changes, using the Court of High Commission and the Star Chamber, drew widespread fear and resentment due to their harsh censorship and degrading punishments. One infamous case involved William Prynne, Henry Burton, and John Bastwick, who were severely punished for publishing pamphlets opposing the bishops. When Charles attempted to enforce similar religious policies in Scotland, he encountered even greater resistance. Despite being born in Scotland, he had become distant from the country, only returning for his coronation in 1633. The Scottish population, who had removed many traditional rituals from their religious practices, were dismayed when Charles insisted on using the Anglican rite for the ceremony. Matters worsened in 1637 when he ordered the introduction of a new prayer book, nearly identical to England's, without consulting the Scottish Parliament or Kirk. Many Scots saw this as an attempt to impose Anglicanism. Riots broke out in Edinburgh, and unrest spread across Scotland, leading to widespread support for the National Covenant, which pledged to defend Scotland's Reformed faith. In response, the Church of Scotland, at its General Assembly in 1638, rejected the new prayer book, abolished episcopal church government, and reinstated Presbyterian governance. Charles saw this as a direct challenge to his authority, sparking the First Bishops' War in 1639. Without seeking financial support from Parliament, he raised an army to confront the Covenanters but, fearing defeat, opted not to engage. The Treaty of Berwick concluded the conflict, restoring some of his authority but at the cost of significant concessions to the Scottish Parliament and Church. The failure of this campaign led to a financial crisis for Charles. His continued support for his Palatine relatives while seeking Spanish funds contributed to the disastrous Battle of the Downs, where a Spanish fleet was destroyed by the Dutch in sight of an inactive English navy. Facing financial ruin, Charles called both the English and Irish parliaments in 1640 in a bid to raise funds. The Irish Parliament granted him a subsidy, but in England, he encountered resistance. His negotiations with the Commons faltered, leading to the dissolution of the short Parliament after only a month. At this time, the Earl of Strafford, Charles's key advisor and Lord Deputy of Ireland, together with Archbishop Laud, pursued a centralizing policy known as thorough. Strafford's influence, despite his initial opposition to the king, grew after he joined royal service in 1628, helping to strengthen Charles's authority. Yet, the failure of the short Parliament emboldened the Scottish Covenanters, who marched into Northumberland in August 1640. With the English forces unable to offer effective resistance, the Scottish army won the Battle of Newburn and occupied Newcastle and Durham. Faced with growing demands for another parliament, Charles summoned a great council of peers, who advised him to call Parliament again and seek peace with the Scots. This resulted in the Treaty of Ripon, which humiliated the king, as it required him to pay the Scottish army daily until a final settlement was reached. The Long Parliament was then summoned. And with the majority of its members opposing Charles, the political landscape was set for greater conflict. Long Parliament. Tensions rise. The Long Parliament presented as many challenges for Charles as the Short Parliament had. Convened on November 3, 1640, it immediately took steps to impeach the king's key advisors on charges of high treason. Strafford was arrested on November 10, followed by the impeachment of Archbishop Laud on December 18. The next day, Lord Keeper Finch was also impeached but fled to The Hague with Charles's approval on December 21. In a move to prevent the king from dissolving Parliament at will, the Triennial Act was passed, mandating that Parliament be summoned at least every 3 years, and giving the Lord Keeper and 12 peers authority to call Parliament if the king failed to do so. Charles reluctantly gave his approval in February 1641, coupled with a subsidy bill. Strafford became the main focus of the parliamentarians, particularly John Pym. His trial for high treason began on March 22, 1641. However, the primary accusation by Sir Henry Vane, that Strafford had threatened to use the Irish army to subdue England, lacked evidence, leading to the collapse of Pym's case on April 10. In response, Pym and his allies introduced a bill of attainder, which bypassed the trial and declared Strafford guilty, with a sentence of death. Charles had assured Strafford that he would not suffer harm to his life, honor, or fortune. The attainder could not pass without the king's consent, and many members of Parliament and peers were opposed, with one stating they did not wish to commit murder with the sword of justice. However, growing unrest and an attempted royalist coup involving army officers in support of Strafford, with Charles implicated, shifted the momentum. On April 20, the Commons passed the bill with a significant majority, and by May, the Lords followed suit. On May 3, Parliament issued a protestation condemning Charles's arbitrary and tyrannical government, while also pledging to defend the king's person, honor, and estate. Charles, fearing for his family amid the escalating unrest, reluctantly approved the attainder on May 9 after consulting with his judges and bishops. Strafford was executed 3 days later. In May, Charles also assented to an extraordinary act preventing the dissolution of Parliament without its own consent. Over the following months, various taxes, such as ship money and fines for distraint of knighthood, were declared unlawful, and the courts of Star Chamber and High Commission were abolished. All remaining forms of taxation were formalized under the Tonnage and Poundage Act. Meanwhile, attempts to curtail the power of bishops and eliminate episcopacy were launched in the House of Commons but failed in the Lords. While Charles made significant concessions in England, he temporarily improved his standing in Scotland by agreeing to a final settlement of the bishops' wars and securing Scottish support during a visit from August to November 1641. He recognized the official establishment of Presbyterianism in Scotland. However, after a failed royalist coup known as the Incident, his credibility was further damaged. Irish Rebellion. Ireland's population was divided into three key groups. The Gaelic Irish, who were Catholic. The Old English, descended from medieval Normans and also primarily Catholic. And the New English, Protestant settlers from England and Scotland, aligned with the English Parliament and the Covenanters. Strafford's administration had boosted the Irish economy and increased tax revenue, but his methods were harsh and authoritarian. He had built up a large Catholic army in support of the king and undermined the Irish Parliament's power. All while continuing to seize Catholic land for Protestant settlers and promoting Laudian Anglicanism, which was deeply opposed by the Presbyterian population. This approach left all three groups discontented. Strafford's impeachment became a pivotal moment in Irish politics, with all factions presenting evidence against him. The Old English, like their counterparts in the English Parliament, maintained that while they opposed Strafford, they remained loyal to Charles, arguing that the king had been misled by bad advisors, and warning against viceroys like Strafford who could become tyrannical figures. Strafford's downfall weakened Charles's influence in Ireland. The English Commons demanded the disbandment of the Irish army 3 times during Strafford's imprisonment. But it wasn't until the end of his trial, when funds were scarce, that Charles finally dissolved the army. Disputes over land transfers from native Catholics to Protestant settlers, especially in Ulster, and growing resentment over the subordination of the Irish Parliament to England, set the stage for rebellion. In late October 1641, violence erupted between the Gaelic Irish and New English, with the Old English siding with the Gaelic Irish while still proclaiming their loyalty to the king. In November 1641, the House of Commons passed the Grand Remonstrance, listing grievances against Charles's ministers and alleging a Catholic conspiracy in which the king was portrayed as an unwitting participant. However, the measure was divisive, passing by just 11 votes. It received little backing from the House of Lords, who were also targeted in the document. Tensions were further heightened by the outbreak of the Irish Rebellion and exaggerated rumors of Charles's involvement. Throughout November, alarming pamphlets circulated, describing atrocities in Ireland, including massacres of New English settlers by the Gaelic Irish. Rumors of Catholic plots intensified anti-Catholic sentiment in England, damaging Charles's standing and authority. When Charles requested funds to suppress the Irish rebellion, many in the Commons suspected that any forces raised might later be turned against them. Pym's militia bill sought to transfer control of the army from the king, but it lacked support in the Lords and was opposed by Charles. The Commons pushed the bill through as an ordinance, claiming it did not require the king's approval. This move increased support for Charles in the Lords. Seeking to consolidate power, Charles made a controversial decision by appointing Colonel Thomas Lunsford, a notorious officer, to command the Tower of London, worsening the already volatile situation in the city. When Charles learned of a plan by Parliament to impeach his wife for allegedly conspiring with the Irish rebels, he decided to take drastic measures. 5 members. Charles suspected, likely correctly, that some members of the English Parliament had conspired with the invading Scots. On January 3, 1642, he ordered Parliament to surrender 5 specific members of the Commons, Pym, John Hampden, Denzil Hollis, William Strode, and Sir Arthur Hazelrig, as well as one peer, Lord Mandeville, on charges of high treason. When Parliament refused, Henrietta Maria possibly persuaded Charles to arrest the 5 members by force, a task he intended to undertake himself. However, news of the warrant reached Parliament first, allowing the targeted men to escape by boat just before Charles arrived at the House of Commons with an armed guard on January 4. Upon entering, he forcibly displaced Speaker William Lenthall from his chair and inquired about the MP's whereabouts. Lenthall, kneeling, famously responded, "May it please your Majesty, I have neither eyes to see nor tongue to speak in this place, but as the House is pleased to direct me, whose servant I am here." In frustration, Charles lamented that, "all my birds have flown," and was compelled to leave empty-handed. This failed arrest attempt proved politically catastrophic for Charles. No English sovereign had ever entered the House of Commons, and his unprecedented intrusion to arrest members was viewed as a serious violation of parliamentary privilege. In one fell swoop, he undermined his supporters' efforts to present him as a protector against chaos and innovation. Parliament quickly took control of London, prompting Charles to flee the capital for Hampton Court Palace on January 10. He moved to Windsor Castle 2 days later, after sending his wife and eldest daughter to safety abroad in February. He traveled north, intending to capture the military arsenal at Hull. To his dismay, he was denied entry by the town's parliamentary governor, Sir John Hotham, in April, forcing Charles to retreat. English Civil War. In mid-1642, both sides began to arm themselves. Charles raised an army using the medieval method of commission of array, while Parliament called for volunteers for its militia. Negotiations proved futile, leading Charles to raise the royal standard in Nottingham on August 22, 1642. By this time, his forces controlled much of the Midlands, Wales, the West Country, and northern England, establishing his court in Oxford. In contrast, Parliament held London, the southeast, East Anglia, and the English Navy. After some skirmishes, the two forces clashed in earnest at Edgehill on October 23, 1642. Charles's nephew, Prince Rupert of the Rhine, disagreed with the royalist commander Lord Lindsay's battle strategy, leading Charles to side with Rupert. Lindsay resigned, leaving Charles to take overall command with Lord Forth's assistance. Rupert's cavalry charged through the parliamentary ranks successfully but chose to plunder the parliamentary baggage train instead of returning promptly to the field. Lindsay, acting as a colonel, was wounded and died from blood loss without medical aid. The battle ended inconclusively as darkness fell. Reflecting on the battle, Charles described himself as exceedingly and deeply grieved. He regrouped in Oxford, rejecting Rupert's proposal for an immediate assault on London. A week later, on November 3, he set out for the capital, capturing Brentford along the way while continuing negotiations with civic and parliamentary delegations. However, at Turnham Green, the royalist army faced resistance from the city militia and, outnumbered, Charles ordered a retreat. He spent the winter in Oxford, reinforcing the city's defenses and preparing for the next campaign. Peace talks between both sides collapsed in April. The war continued with indecisiveness for the next couple of years, during which Henrietta Maria returned to Britain for 17 months starting in February 1643. After Rupert captured Bristol in July 1643, Charles visited the port city and laid siege to Gloucester further up the River Severn. His plans to undermine the city walls failed due to heavy rain, and as a parliamentary relief force approached, Charles lifted the siege and withdrew to Sudeley Castle. The parliamentary army turned back towards London, and Charles pursued them, leading to a confrontation at Newbury, Berkshire, on September 20. As with Edgehill, the battle ended in a stalemate at nightfall, resulting in disengagement. In January 1644, Charles convened a parliament at Oxford, which included around 40 peers and 118 Commons members. The Oxford Parliament, which met until March 1645, was supported by a majority of peers and about a third of the Commons. However, Charles grew disillusioned with its ineffectiveness, referring to it as a mongrel in private letters to his wife. Throughout 1644, while Charles remained in the southern half of England, Rupert rode north to relieve Newark and York from the threat posed by Parliamentary and Scottish Covenanter armies. Charles achieved victory at the Battle of Cropredy Bridge in late June but faced defeat at the Battle of Marston Moor shortly afterward. Continuing his campaign in the south, he encircled and disarmed the parliamentary army led by the Earl of Essex. Returning north to his base in Oxford, he engaged in a second battle at Newbury before winter set in, which again ended without a clear victor. Efforts to negotiate a settlement during the winter, while both sides rearmed and reorganized, proved unsuccessful once more. At the Battle of Naseby on June 14, 1645, Rupert's cavalry mounted a successful charge against the flank of Parliament's new model army. However, elsewhere on the battlefield, Charles's troops were pushed back. As he attempted to rally his men, Lord Carnwath seized the bridle of his horse, fearing for the king's safety. The royalist soldiers misinterpreted this action as a signal to retreat, leading to a collapse in their position. This battle marked a significant shift in favor of Parliament. In the aftermath, the Royalists faced a series of defeats, culminating in the Siege of Oxford, from which Charles escaped disguised as a servant in April 1646. He surrendered to the Scottish Presbyterian army besieging Newark and was taken to Newcastle upon Tyne. After 9 months of negotiations, the Scots reached an agreement with the English Parliament. In exchange for £100,000 and a promise of further payments, they withdrew from Newcastle and handed Charles over to parliamentary commissioners in January 1647. Captivity. Parliament held Charles under house arrest at Holdenby House in Northamptonshire until June 3. When Cornet George Joyce, acting on behalf of the new model army, forcibly removed him. By this time, a mutual suspicion had developed between Parliament, which favored disbanding the army and promoting Presbyterianism, and the new model army, primarily led by Congregationalist independents seeking a greater political role. Charles recognized the growing divisions and saw Joyce's actions as an opportunity rather than a threat. Initially, he was taken to Newmarket at his suggestion, then moved to Oatlands and later Hampton Court, as negotiations continued without success. By November, Charles decided it would be in his best interests to escape, possibly to France, southern England, or Berwick-upon-Tweed near the Scottish border. On November 11, he fled Hampton Court and, from the shores of Southampton Water, contacted Colonel Robert Hammond, the parliamentary governor of the Isle of Wight, whom he believed to be sympathetic. However, Hammond confined Charles in Carisbrooke Castle and informed Parliament of his custody. From Carisbrooke, Charles continued attempts to negotiate with various parties. In a stark contrast to his earlier conflict with the Scottish Kirk, he signed a secret treaty with the Scots on December 26, 1647. Under this agreement, known as the Engagement, the Scots agreed to invade England on Charles's behalf, restoring him to the throne in exchange for the establishment of Presbyterianism in England for 3 years. The Royalists rose in May 1648, igniting the Second Civil War, and as agreed, the Scots invaded England. However, uprisings in Kent, Essex, and Cumberland, along with a rebellion in South Wales, were suppressed by the new model army. With the defeat of the Scots at the Battle of Preston in August 1648, the Royalists lost their chance of winning the war. Charles had no choice but to return to negotiations, which were held at Newport on the Isle of Wight. On December 5, 1648, Parliament voted 129 to 83 in favor of continuing talks with the king. However, Oliver Cromwell and the army opposed further discussions with someone they regarded as a tyrant and began consolidating their power. Hammond was replaced as governor of the Isle of Wight on November 27 and placed in army custody the following day. During Pride's purge on December 6 and 7, Colonel Thomas Pride arrested or excluded from Parliament those members sympathetic to the military, while others chose to stay away voluntarily. The remaining members formed what became known as the Rump Parliament, marking an effective military coup. Trial. Charles was moved to Hurst Castle at the end of 1648 and subsequently transferred to Windsor Castle. In January 1649, the Rump Parliament's House of Commons formally indicted him for treason. However, this charge was met with opposition from the House of Lords, which rejected it outright. The notion of putting a king on trial was a radical and unprecedented step in English history, leading to significant legal and political debates. Prominent figures, such as the Chief Justices of England's 3 common law courts, Henry Rawle, Oliver St. John, and John Wilde, strongly opposed the indictment, deeming it unlawful and a dangerous precedent. Despite the dissent, the Rump Commons asserted its authority to legislate independently and passed a bill to create a special court for Charles's trial, declaring this bill an act that required no royal assent. This High Court of Justice was established by the Act and included a total of 135 commissioners. However, many of these commissioners either refused to serve or chose not to attend, reflecting the contentious atmosphere surrounding the trial. Ultimately, only 68 commissioners, each firmly aligned with the Parliament, participated in Charles's trial on charges of high treason and other high crimes. This trial commenced on January 20, 1649, in Westminster Hall, a historic venue that underscored the gravity of the proceedings. John Bradshaw was appointed as president of the court. And the prosecution was led by Solicitor General John Cook, who sought to hold the king accountable for his actions. The charges against Charles painted a grim picture of a monarch who had betrayed his nation. He was accused of treason by prioritizing his personal interests over the welfare of the English people. The indictment claimed that Charles had engaged in a wicked design to erect and uphold in himself an unlimited and tyrannical power to rule according to his will, thereby undermining the rights and liberties of his subjects. The prosecution alleged that he had traitorously and maliciously levied war against the present parliament and the people therein represented. In essence, the indictment argued that Charles's actions were motivated by self-interest rather than the common good, stating that his wicked designs, wars, and evil practices served only to advance his personal power and the interests of his family at the expense of public welfare, justice, and peace. In a significant legal development, the indictment invoked the modern concept of command responsibility, asserting that Charles was guilty of all the treasons, murders, rapines, burnings, spoils, desolations, damages, and mischiefs to this nation that had occurred during the war. This assertion was underscored by the staggering death toll, with an estimated 300,000 people, about 6% of the population, having lost their lives during the conflict. Throughout the first 3 days of the trial, Charles was repeatedly asked to enter a plea, but he consistently refused to do so. He challenged the legitimacy of the court and the authority under which he was being tried, famously stating, "I would know by what power I am called hither, by what lawful authority." Charles argued that no court possessed jurisdiction over a monarch, claiming that his right to rule was divinely ordained and supported by the established laws of England. He contended that the power wielded by those trying him was based solely on force rather than legal authority. Charles asserted that the trial was inherently illegal, emphasizing, "No earthly power can justly call me, who am your king, in question as a delinquent. This day's proceeding cannot be warranted by God's laws, for, on the contrary, the authority of obedience unto kings is clearly warranted, and strictly commanded in both the Old and New Testament, for the law of this land. I am no less confident that no learned lawyer will affirm that an impeachment can lie against the king, they all going in his name. And one of their maxims is that the king can do no wrong, the higher house is totally excluded. And for the House of Commons, it is too well known that the major part of them are detained or deterred from sitting. The arms I took up were only to defend the fundamental laws of this kingdom against those who have supposed my power hath totally changed the ancient government." In contrast, the court challenged the long-standing doctrine of sovereign immunity, proposing a revolutionary idea. That the King of England was not a person, but an office whose every occupant was entrusted with a limited power to govern by and according to the laws of the land and not otherwise. This marked a significant shift in the understanding of monarchy and governance in England. After 3 days of proceedings, Charles was removed from the court. The court then heard testimony from over 30 witnesses against him in his absence over the next 2 days. On January 26, he was formally condemned to death. The following day, Charles was brought before a public session of the commission, where he was declared guilty and sentenced. The judgment read, "For all which treasons and crimes, this court doth adjudge that he, the said Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy to the good people of this nation, shall be put to death by the severing of his head from his body." 59 of the commissioners signed Charles's death warrant, sealing his fate in a momentous and controversial chapter of English history. Execution. Charles's execution was scheduled for Tuesday, January 30, 1649. 2 of his children, Elizabeth and Henry, remained in England under the control of Parliament. They were allowed to visit him on January 29, and he bid them a tearful farewell. The following morning, Charles requested 2 shirts to guard against the cold, ensuring that any shivers he might exhibit would not be mistaken for fear. He stated, "The season is so sharp that it may make me shake, which some observers may imagine proceeds from fear. I would have no such imputation." Under guard, he walked from St. James's Palace, where he had been confined, to Whitehall Palace, where an execution scaffold was set up in front of the banqueting house. Large ranks of soldiers separated Charles from the spectators, meaning his last speech reached only those with him on the scaffold. He reflected on his fate, linking it to his earlier failure to save his loyal servant, Strafford. An unjust sentence that I suffered to take effect is punished now by an unjust sentence on me. He expressed his desire for the liberty and freedom of the people, asserting, their liberty and freedom consists in having government. It is not their having a share in the government, that is nothing appertaining unto them. A subject and a sovereign are clean different things. He concluded, I shall go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown, where no disturbance can be. At approximately 2 p.m., after offering a prayer, Charles placed his head on the block and signaled the executioner that he was ready by stretching out his hands. He was beheaded in one clean stroke. Observers noted a collective moan from the crowd, described by Philip Henry as a sound as I never heard before and desire I may never hear again. Some in the crowd dipped their handkerchiefs in the king's blood as a memento. Cromwell was said to have visited Charles's coffin, sighing, cruel necessity. This scene was later captured in a painting by de la Roche in the 19th century. De la Roche also depicted the moment titled Charles I insulted by Cromwell's soldiers, an allegory for events in France and the mocking of Christ. The identity of the executioner remains debated. Initially, the commissioners approached Richard Brandon, London's common hangman. But he refused the task, despite an offer of £200, a substantial sum at the time. There are suggestions he may have taken the job after being threatened with death. Though other names have emerged as potential executioners, including George Joyce, William Hewlett and Hugh Peters. The clean strike, later confirmed